Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Berry, co-founder of IR Labs, and I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Faulkner, Senior Vice President, Listings and Regulation at the Canadian Securities Exchange, and Joanna Cameron, Partner, Corporate at Osler. Today, we have brought together an expert panel who will shed light on the changes in regulatory oversight of promotional activities by Canadian issuers. These new and pending regulatory changes have sparked discussions across the industry, and Joanna and Mark are here to provide you with practical advice on how to navigate the changing landscape. Today's capital markets environment is highly unique and has changed drastically over the last few years, let alone the decades. I still remember when I faxed in my first news release. Now we issue news releases with videos, photos, we post on social media, we send a beautifully crafted e-blast to databases, and we post on the website. And then we try and pitch that news to the media as well. It is truly quite the production. We recognize we're operating in an environment where investor meetings and analyst coverage is becoming harder to get, and breaking through the noise and creating visibility requires a lot more creativity and resources. I want to share this example at the outset as you think through your IR strategy and hear from Mark and Joanna momentarily. Today, we represent companies in various sectors and industries, a range of market caps and stages in their public company life cycle. Some are RTOs, some are direct lists, and some have syndicates of investment banks supporting them. Each one is unique. The companies that have spent less on promotional activities in general have fared better in these markets than those who have spent big budgets to achieve momentum. We work with a lot of really great vendors who run very thoughtful marketing programs, create video, drive leads, and we quarterback this process for our clients. But we also maintain a list of bad actors out there, and those are the ones you need to truly look out for. When we met to discuss our vision for today's session with you, we want the information we're about to share to be extremely practical and offer you some suggestions on how to navigate this unique environment we're operating in today. Going back to my example of the companies that didn't spend money on marketing activities, here's what they did. We issued thoughtful news releases that included video, photos, and really amplifying the storytelling. These companies set out realistic goals for the year and reported against them regularly, following the philosophy of tell them what you're going to do, go do it, and then remind them what you did. I'm a fan of reminding people multiple times. We created visibility for the company and CEOs by putting them on podcasts, achieving earned media coverage, and nurturing those warm leads by speaking with investors regularly, reaching out to them personally to share news, hosting webinars, which are a wonderful tactic to drive leads, writing blog posts and article content about the company that's not promotional, but also not sharing material, non-public information. Instead, these pieces we refer to as owned media, as content pieces that the company drips out to its own investor base. If anyone has any questions on this, I'm happy to discuss that offline. These are just a few ideas. There is so much you can do while staying compliant and being creative. And the companies that have taken a more grassroots approach to building their IR program and engaging their investment community, they have also all raised money in the last couple of months. I'd be happy to chat more offline about these examples. With that, let's get started. First, I'd like to introduce you to our guests. Mark joined the CSE in 2003, shortly after it was recognized as a quotation and trade reporting system. He was appointed Senior Vice President, Listings and Regulation in 2022. Mark is responsible for the exchange's regulatory activities, including new listings and ongoing issuer compliance. In 2021, the CSE published the most comprehensive policy changes since being recognized as an exchange consistent with its public interest mandate and regulatory obligations, and in line with the CSE's proven model of streamlined regulation and customer service. Prior to joining the CSE, Mark had a 14-year career at the Toronto Stock Exchange and market regulation services in both trading services and regulatory positions. Joanna is a partner in the corporate group at Osler's Vancouver office. She practices corporate and securities law with a focus primarily on capital markets transactions and business law matters, including equity and debt financings, reverse takeovers, IPOs, as well as public and private M&A. Joanna also provides ongoing advice to public and private companies regarding corporate governance, continuous disclosure obligations, Canadian Stock Exchange issues, and various other corporate and securities law compliance matters. Joanna has particular expertise and experience in the resource sector, having previously been Vice President, Legal and General Counsel for a pre-development stage mining issuer listed on both the TSX and the New York Stock Exchange, but has also been involved in transactions for clients of all stages in tech, cannabis, retail, forestry, and shipping industries. Following today's presentation, we will open it up for questions. We'll let Mark and Joanna move through their presentation, and then I will moderate us through a Q&A. And with that, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here. Presentation is up okay on your side, Joanna, Mark? Perfect.
It is. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right. I, of course, having legal and regulators on the line, our disclaimer slide, I will refer us all to. And I will pass it over to Joanna to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you. So we are going through these regulatory changes in some chronological order. The first of which I should highlight is still a proposed instrument is 51501. And then there's a decision of the BC Securities Commission. And then Mark is going to run through the CSE policy changes. And then we'll discuss some of the offshoot topics to those. But so going chronologically again, BC Instrument 51519, excuse me, came in May of 2021. I did some digging. There still doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity as to when it will be implemented, and not sure what the extent, if that's a function of the extent of the comments that were received, because the comment period has closed some time ago. In any event, these instruments don't tend to come out of left field. They are frequently the result of years of continuous disclosure reviews by the CSA and the various commissions. And it is a function of where they see the hotspots of disclosure issues. And promotional activity is definitely one. It's been on the radar screen for some time. As Alyssa said, I think the proliferation of the types of platforms that are being used has increased the scrutiny on it. And I think it's going to continue, frankly. So BC Instrument 519, again, not yet in force, adds some disclosure, prescribes disclosure for investment or promotional activity related activities. And to put it bluntly, they fall into three buckets. One is one that's going to apply to all promotional communication, and it's going to apply to all issuers. The second one is news releases and MD&A, and those will only apply to venture issuers. I think venture issuers, unfortunately, do sort of take the heat, and I imagine it's largely represented on this webinar. So I'm going to talk about all three of them, even though two of them only relate to venture issuers. So for promotional communication, what that is going to require is that on all promotional and communications, and that is going to include oral statements, they are prescribing certain information, which is not a big departure from what I'm about to tell you you're going to have to put in news releases, and Mark's going to talk about in terms of the CSE changes. But it will include disclosure as to the identity of the person conducting the activity, the ownership of the shares in the issuer, any intentions with respect to that ownership of securities, and some other prescribed items such as how much they're getting paid, what platforms or mediums are going to use to disseminate the information, and any other intentions to acquire securities of the issuer. So that's going to have to go in all promotional communications. And then news releases, which is largely going to be triggered when you commence that. So, to be blunt, when you just sign an engagement letter with a firm, it's going to trigger a news release requirement, which, as Mark will pick up later, is going to be largely mirrored in the CSE requirements. So for those listed on the CSE, you're already there. And that disclosure is going to include a description of the activity, when it starts, when it will end, contact information of who's providing it, their relationship with the issuer, and again, the nature of the platform and what the compensation is. Finally, and this is certainly more discreet, which is in the MD&A, if more than 10% of your total expenditures, and that is relative to your total operating expenses, is on promotional activities. You're going to have to disclose that in your MD&A and likely provide a background, dissect it further into its components. The other thing, and we're going to pick up this, is certainly one of the takeaways, is if you are going to engage a third-party provider for promotional activities, the issuer is going to have to put in some processes and procedures to ensure that there is oversight on those activities. The last part, and for those in Ontario who think this doesn't apply to you, it will apply anybody conducting promotional activities in BC and anybody with a real and substantial connection to BC. Given the nature of communication these days and how quickly it goes from coast to coast and the lack of control you have exactly where it goes, and the borders are fairly porous, that is not an argument I would be wanting to run with. And so if you are a reporting issuer in BC, assume you're there. And frankly, if you're a reporting issuer in Canada, I would suggest strongly that you comply rather than have to argue that your communication didn't land in BC or that you have no shareholders here. That I would not, I don't think, line you up for a winning argument. So the next one would be the stocks social decision. So a couple of year gap. So the 51501 came out in May 2021, and the stock social decision came out in just the beginning of this year. And what's interesting about that is it did two things. It was the first decision to actually consider Section 52(2) of the BC Securities Act and actually provide some guidance around what it means. So what happened in Stock Social is a firm providing promotional activities engaged by a whole series of issuers was putting out a series of advertorials and dozens of social media posts. And what they weren't doing is saying that those advertorials and communications were done on behalf of those various issuers. And that's what got them into trouble. And I think that the big picture here is what the commission is after, clearly, between this decision and what they're proposing the instrument, is transparency. They are, what the danger they see in all of their decisions are actually trying to do that is try and flag and address and mitigate a danger to the investing public. And what they're looking for is activities and practices that don't allow investors to make fully informed decisions. And one of those practices that had emerged that the stock social decision seeks to quell is communication that looks like it's third party and independent, and it's not. It's paid for by an issuer. And often people don't include a statement that it's on behalf of an issuer, or they put it way at the bottom, and people read these on phones and all the time and no one notices. And after a while, you see enough of these and you think they're all independent and third party, you think this business, maybe it's great, maybe it's not, but certainly this communication isn't going to let you make an informed decision on that, because the disclosure you think is objective is not. And one of the other practices that had emerged that the commission took a point of saying not good enough, guys, is when instead of saying this is done on behalf of the issuer, you say the source of the information is the issuer. And that's different. The source is what newspapers do to get a quote. That's not the same. And what they've said is you need to disclose in plain language in a prominent spot, i.e. up front. And in fairness, what the commissions usually think is going to be prominent is not what every issuer wants is prominent. So the practice will probably emerge somewhere between the prior practice, which was buried at the bottom, and what the BC Commission has said is gold standard, because that's typically what happened. But the days of it being buried at the bottom are over. And so what they want in plain language, prominent spot, is that it was disseminated on behalf of the issuer. So saying things like disseminated on behalf of issuer Y, or this is paid advertisement. So it is a decision that I think highlights the way we're going. It highlights where the commissions are focusing enforcement attention. It is it's in the crosshairs, frankly, and that decision is fairly clear. So then I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk about the third in our iteration of the recent history and the regulation of promotional activities.
Thanks, Joanna. When we talk about these being recent activities, but we first published the guidance notice that related to these new policy requirements back in 2021, July of 2021. And then they were introduced into our overhaul of the policies. And Alyssa mentioned that in my bio earlier, that we did the biggest review or amendments to our policies and published them in 2021 in our entire history. They were so large that it took until April of 2023 for them to actually be implemented following the publication. So we started with this guidance notice, and it was intentionally put out to reflect the requirements in the proposed BC instrument. So a lot of what we've got in there is exactly what is in the instrument and will be required when the instrument's implemented. But the key changes, we now have our policy 7, which is significant transactions, has been expanded. So it includes investor relations and promotional activity. And again, that supports the definition of promotional activity that was added to the BC Act and is in the instrument. We restricted compensation to cash only. In the past, it had sort of been looked at as a debt settlement. So we don't have a specific debt for services policy. However, IR was a service and it was often paid in shares. And we've restricted that now to cash only, other than some options within certain limits. And that's in the next one. We have allowed that increase to 2% of the outstanding, which is in line with the venture exchange. It used to be 1%. It was 1% for a long time. Now it's in line with the venture exchange. And when we look at the news release, and Joanna mentioned this earlier, that the news release is a requirement, even though that's still a proposed instrument, with these policies in effect for our listed issuers, now the news release is a requirement, and it has all the things that are specified in the instrument are now in our policy. And it's an easy way for us to start a review, and because those press releases go through IROC or CIRO now, and so we can make sure that the disclosure is already there right from the start. So when an issuer enters into that agreement with a person who's going to conduct the activity, the disclosure has to be made in that news release up front. And then we also have the Form 10 filing requirement that would have all these supporting details in it. And we also added in this was already in the CSE policies, but we've again made it explicit in policy 7, because we've added a couple of additional things that we'll look at when we're looking at suitability. And we've got them sort of in addition to all the things that we would have already looked at. Now we're looking at excessive payments for promotional activity, or if an individual has been associated with or failed to prevent on behalf of an issuer the production, approval, or distribution of overly promotional materials. So this way, if we have a problem, if we've had some concerns about certain campaigns that a person was responsible for, whether they were conducting IR activity directly for an issuer as an officer or director of the issuer, or whether they were offering it as a service, we may find that person unacceptable. And there may be limitations. It may be unacceptable to have responsibility for the promotional materials, or it may actually be as an officer or director of a listed company. So we already had that discretion under our policies, but we've made it a little bit more clear in how it would relate to the promotional activity. And if we look at the promotional activity, we've mentioned a couple of times now that the definition of promotional activity was added into the BC Securities Act, and that was in May of 2020. So investor relations activities was replaced, or the definition was replaced with promotional activity. And that's the same definition that we've adopted into our policy amendments, again, to support the BC Act and the 51519. So promotional activity means any activity, including for greater certainty, any oral or written communication that by itself or together with one or more other activities encourages or reasonably could be expected to encourage a person, A, to purchase, not purchase, trade or not trade a security, or B, to trade or not trade a derivative, but does not include an activity prescribed for the purpose of this definition. And it is overly broad. It's been criticized as overly broad. That was in some of the comments received, that it's broad and conflates investor relations activities with promotional activities. But it still encompasses activity that may previously suggest was marketing, not investor relations.
So the other key change that I think often gets overlooked, and where one of the reasons I think it's important, because the commission took the BC Commission and the amendments in May 2020 to the Securities Act, gave itself some more tools to enforce overly promotional activities. And what it did is it introduced a new section 50 sub 3 in the Securities Act. And there are 3 prongs to get yourself into trouble there. One is that you're actually conducting promotional activity, which Mark just went over. 2, it is in a statement or an information that you've provided that a reasonable investor would consider important in determining whether or not to purchase, trade, or not trade or purchase shares. So if you, in one of those 2 things, and that statement or information that you've provided is determined to be false or misleading, you will have contravened the BC Securities Act and opened yourself up to the full suite of enforcement actions that would lead to. And we're going to touch on this a few times, because I think this is what most people are wanting as examples of what is going to get you in hot water. A lot of this is specific, but the overriding concept isn't new. And there's tons of guidance that's been out there for a while. There's national policies that will give you some really good guidance on what is good disclosure. And some of this is not new. It's basics, like your disclosure has to be balanced. You have to, and no one likes this, but you have to put out bad news as quickly as you put out good news. You can't, if you're making claims about the business, you have to be able to substantiate them. Extreme exaggeration, hyperbole, not good. Opinion-based comments, not great as well. Another one that's common is news releases for the sake of saying something, but it's actually not material news. And we see that there's just seems to be some desire to flood the airwaves, and that has come up in CSA reviews. Anyone who's curious, they'll give you a laundry list of it in CSA Staff Notice 51-356, aptly called problematic promotional activities by an issuer. Another one, not enough factual or context for what you're saying. And we've touched on this with the Stack Social decision, but content that is disguised as being independent when it's not. And if the stand back overarching test, is it activity that's generally undertaken to artificially promote an interest in your business as opposed to conveying and communicating what your business is doing and what the industry around it perhaps is doing, but most importantly, what your business is doing. Going back to Alyssa's opening remarks, what was your objectives? Where are you? Are you actioning them? Where are you on that trajectory that you've advised people is your business plan? So if that's the communication, you're fine. If you're have other short-term intentions, you are going to run some risks.
Oh, you're on mute, Mark.
Thank you. Similar to the CSA, we still see disclosure and promotional advertising campaigns or advertorials with unbalanced and unsubstantiated claims, and whether it's about business or investment opportunities for investors. So the enhanced disclosure requirements that we've added that were sort of mirror 51519 are consistent with our approach, and our approach for a long time has been to provide investors with straightforward information relevant to their investment decisions. We've often called it an enhanced disclosure model, where we required a little bit more disclosure and we did less review. So requiring this additional disclosure up front is consistent with that. And because problematic promotional activity undermines the integrity of the capital markets, the reputations of the exchanges, it puts investors at risk because they make uninformed or misinformed investment decisions. And so the requirement that compensation only be paid in cash also reduces the direct opportunity for a promoter to profit from an artificial increase in the issuer's share price. And we will talk a bit more about compensation and that opportunity for profit. But it was really our objective to support the broader changes in the industry and keep them consistent with our original model, that we can do this with disclosure, we can give investors, shareholders, and the market in general the information they need to continue making informed decisions. So we were taught as young children not to take candy from strangers. And we also learned later, don't believe everything you read. And of course, that evolved into don't believe everything you read on the internet. And people joke about it all the time. I saw it on the internet, it must be true. But broad distribution of by email of marketing materials and presentations or social media posts with positive messages and no supporting information lead to the best bit of common sense advice. If it sounds too good to be true, then it's probably a promotion. This type of campaign without any disclosure about how the publisher or distributor is compensated for it, or if it's on behalf of the issuer or an insider of the issuer, that's problematic. And when we talk about compensation, as I mentioned, we've recently changed the policy so that compensation must be in cash. So any scheme to achieve indirectly what's not permitted directly could be problematic. If the person's conducting the activity participate in a private placement shortly before or during the term of a contract, and especially if the value of that investment is similar to the compensation paid for the services and no disclosures made about that ownership, that's problematic. That's setting up that promoter to profit directly from the price movement. And we've seen this in the past. There have been some fairly high profile cases of consultants offering services like this with a position in the company. And when we talk about red flags in contracts, there's one of them. Another one that's misunderstood, and Joanna just talked about it a bit, is the pattern of non-material news releases. And this is important because it can be misconstrued. You know, you believe that you're being told you can't put out a non-material news release. And that's not the issue. It's a pattern, a repetition and non-material announcements just to stay in the news. The issuers and IR firms want to know they can communicate effectively, and news releases are part of timely disclosure and the continuous disclosure record. But when those news releases are coming out at a frequency that rivals the most prolific tweeters, we have to consider the intent and the content. And when the continuous disclosure record in the CSE Form 7, that's our monthly progress report, reflect a lack of actual business activity, then an inordinate time spent by management putting out immaterial news releases and monitoring market activity may be an indication that the priority is to influence the market price influence the market price directly rather than indirectly through building value in the company. And we've heard the argument, we're building value for shareholders. Well, build value in the company, not directly in the share price.
So now if you're an issuer, you're looking at engaging a firm to do some IR or promotional activities, and what should you look for in the service contract? And my usual advice, and shockingly, quite a number of the contracts that I get in the first draft are completely bereft of really anything. They're often just over a page. And I usually insist on a few things, one of which is first and foremost a covenant on behalf of the service provider that they are going to comply with all applicable securities laws. And I often say specifically including the disclosure requirements if 515109 comes in place, and in the meantime pursuant to the guidance in the stock social decision. A representation that to the extent any of their activities are going to require registration, they have their registration. Ensure that the compensation is not based on share price appreciation. Include an indemnification if they do not comply with this agreement and you've put in those other covenants. It's not going to be cheap because you're going to get dragged in. Include an indemnification. May not be worth anything ultimately in the end day, but you're better with it than without it. Ensure you have final control over the product. You're obligated to anyway, but if you don't have a contractual nexus with that service provider to provide you with the drafts before it goes out, you're going to have a legal obligation and no contractual right to ensure you can meet it, which is where you never want to be. So ensure you have the right to drafts, the right to comment on it. It is, after all, your disclosure. And Mark's touched on this because it's a frequent theme. There's nothing saying you can't invest in the issuer. But if the compensation is structured so that there is a private placement subscription that is at or near our time of the engagement, and lo and behold, it is in almost the same amount as the service fees, it is going to look a lot like you're doing indirectly what you can't do directly. And I, for one, with you, good luck in trying to contest wasn't a payment in shares. So those would be my highlight reel of what to put in your agreement, what to look for when you're reviewing it. My red flags are pretty simple. Anyone who can't agree to any of that. If you can't agree in writing to comply with the law and indemnify me if you don't, I'm not sure it's the service provider for you.
All right, well, this takes us to key takeaways, which we won't read everything on this slide, but Joanna and Mark, a lot of information in here to unpack. It's a heavy topic, but really do see this as an opportunity to level the playing field and to really focus our efforts on things that are strategic and truly are going to add value, as you both alluded to. Any final comments here before we move into the Q&A?
I think it's just, the markets are challenging, there's no doubt. And unfortunately, the reason these changes are out there is because this literally just promotion for the sake of it has become a bit of a norm. And there is a lot of a misconception where you see competitors and other issuers doing it, and what you don't see as any consequences to that. It starts to look like that's okay because they do it. The number of times I get that is, but they said X and look like nothing's happened. Well, A, you don't know. And two, you don't know what's coming. And three, if someone goes 80 through a school zone, it doesn't mean it's okay. And nor should you do it. So there is, but I get the temptation. There is the view that what's on CDAR is being reviewed by someone. No, it hasn't. Chances are it hasn't. It's just there. And so I guess it's the way this is going is where it should be, which is disclosure that is related to the value you're building in your business. And frankly, if you believe in your business, shouldn't be a problem with it.
Mark, final comments?
I have to agree completely with everything Joanna just said. I think those are really the key points. It is difficult, but I think the real important distinction there is between what's permitted or what's compliant and what you actually see. Just because you saw somebody else do it, or you see that information or an advertorial or some campaign running, it doesn't mean that it's completely compliant, and you have no idea who's looking at that in the background, whether it's at the exchange level or one of the regulators looking at that material. One of the things to remember about that is we can look at a contract if we were to review a contract before the issuer entered into it or before it was made public, we could review the contract and the contract looks fine. We can't review all of the information that's prepared and any of those email blasts or any of the posts that are made. We can't review them all, and we certainly can't review them all before they go out. And it's the same whether it's at the exchange level or the market regulator or a securities regulator. We find these things after the fact. And the fact that you see them out there, or there appears to be a successful campaign because you see somebody else's, you see some appreciation in the stock price and that the activity picks up, and you think, wow, that's a successful campaign. We want that kind of interest in our stock. That doesn't mean that everything that they've done in that campaign is perfect or compliant. So it's really important that you stick to these principles and look at the requirements, get appropriate counsel, discuss them with the exchange or with the securities regulator if you need to. But make sure that you're following these principles, not following the crowd.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. I'm going to move on to a Q&A session, and we're all very privileged to have both Mark and Joanna here. So please send through your questions in the Q&A chat. First question that's come through here. I've outsourced my social media. Do I need to review every tweet and post that my contractor is sending out?
How many are they sending out?
As not clarified in the question, Joanna,
right.
but here we go.
Yeah, I think you do.
And Joanna, just building on that, as as an investor relations firm working for issuers, I'll ask the question, if there are guidelines and processes in place, and let's say there is comfort in a relationship that you have, essentially that person might be outsourced, like in a IR Labs, for example, and they are following the rules, they're sticking to the facts. What does an issuer, what's the responsibility on the issuer in that circumstance?
Like, there is an element of practicality to it, right? And if you've had a relationship that's built a fair amount of trust over, not a week, but a certain, like a decent runway, that you've got a reasonable basis that you've been running on a cadence with that service provider, the disclosure is always like, you've got a pattern. They understand what it is this issuer likes to put out and what their expectations are for disclosure. You're going to be responsible for it, but what the time you're investing in looking at it is going to decrease, and I guess then you're running the risk that they just go rogue on you, and all of a sudden what they put out is completely out of left field. Yeah, you're going to run that risk, but it's a judgment call, probably, given it's a function of how long the relationship is, how deep it is, and what your trust factor is. And the longer, the better that is, the more runway you have and the more leeway you have to trust that it's not going to be in left field.
Next question here, just to clarify the where jurisdictions, I guess. So Joanna, you touched on this a little bit at the beginning. We're here speaking with the CSE today. Can you, at a very high level, touch on what other exchanges, is this applicable if I'm a TSX issuer, is the question here, and clarify, Joanna, the piece about BC.
Sure. So the proposed instrument has disclosure put into three buckets, but the promotional communications, which is going to be, I expect, going to be viewed broadly, that applies to all issuers. So on the TSX, BCI instrument 5519 will be applicable, at least in part. The second, as to the BC securities, and I'll back up on that. Even the requirements for the news release disclosure, it's already the CSE's put in, it's not far off what the venture exchange is requiring. Maybe there's one or two line items, but if you're that allergic to some of those differences, then I think you need to stand back. So I don't it's a distinction without a difference between them. It is, it's just the expectation for, so between the CSE and the venture exchange, no. TSX, yes, lighter touch. That has been some of the criticism of BC Instrument 51519. It's imposing requirements on TSX issuers that they're not getting through their exchange listing, whereas for venture issuers, this in large part is consistent with what's being expected of them through the policies of their applicable exchange, be it the CSE or the venture exchange. So as for the BC Act, I haven't looked at Ontario, but again, I think given today's porous borders when it comes to disclosure, I don't think you are going to be able to engage in activities that somehow would be okay in Ontario, but would be offside this BC rule. I can't think of what that would be, because all of this is a public policy. The mandate of every one of these commissions is investor protection. It is a level playing field. It is effective capital markets. It is informed decisions. It's transparency. So if what is generally has been happening in regulation, we see it in ESG, is disclosure. It's a principle-based focus and concept. And then what happens is it has to get prescriptive because people can't stay within the principles and they need more guidance. So it's overarching. It's a principle-based approach. So often what happens from an enforcement perspective is, frankly, if this is unfair and is prejudicial to the interest of investing in public, it's going to fall under the public policy concept and investor protection. So you're going to get there one way or another.
Got it. Next question here. Are issuers expected to disclose through news releases their participation in each investor conference they present at? You've seen those press releases. We're presenting at XYZ event, speaking on a panel. There's no disclosure obligation.
Not that I am aware of.
I wouldn't think so. Not for a specific news release from the issuer. I wouldn't think so.
No.
Okay. Question here. Do I need to run every news release by IROC?
CSE, yes. Venture exchange, not unless it's an enumerated content. And the other thing about IROC, to give them, what we get a lot of the time is IROC approved this last time and now they have an issue with it. And we've said this, this is a human being. You are not, I could give anyone here a piece of paper twice. You're not going to find the same typos the second time around. And so just because, it's skated through the first time and they catch it the second doesn't mean it's okay. It just means they didn't get it the first time. That's it. That's the conclusion to draw. But the CSE, all my clients would put everything through IROC.
What we would accept if once the issuers have been here for a while, or depending on the frequency and materiality of the news releases, we do have issuers putting them out overnight, which isn't as much of a concern. IROC does get a chance to review them on the wire in the morning before market open. But yeah, during the day, we would expect them all to go through IROC, and especially sometimes IROC needs some guidance with some of the issuers to determine materiality, whether or not a halt's required, and whether or not everything's there. And IROC is our front line for reviewing the content of a news release to also help us determine whether or not the information in the news release, or whatever the event or transaction that's about to be announced, whether or not any policy requirements have been triggered. And that's often how we find something where the issuer does need some additional guidance, or they may not have been aware of something that's going to get triggered when they make that announcement. So it's not always the most material announcements, and especially with the new policies, there are additional disclosure requirements, there are additional shareholder approval requirements. So it is important that they get that guidance before the news release goes out. So if it's during market hours, they should definitely go through IROC first, or CIRO, I think it's called now, CIRO or CHIRO. I'm not exactly sure how they're saying it yet.
Okay, just someone's asking a clarifying question. So does that mean only news releases that we, I assume as the issuer, here, deem material need to be put through IROC or CRO?
I think I just covered that right at the end, probably after the question came in. IROC can help determine materiality too.
Perfect. Okay, I just want to build on this for a quick second. I have the good fortune of working with Joanna with a few of my clients. Joanna, so it's 4 o'clock, becomes 9 o'clock at night. We're still working on the press release. Maybe board resolutions have been signed overnight. There's a lot of issuers on the CSE, for example, who are in other parts of the world as well. So board approvals may happen, in the middle of the night, whether it's Israel or the UK or whatever it may be. And there's really not that opportunity to send that press release at 4 in the morning. I'm sitting here in Vancouver for review to IROC and ultimately get that feedback, trying to track down someone who can answer questions. So how do we navigate through that? And there's a disclosure responsibility. A board resolution has been signed. We now need to get that news out.
Right. So you back up from the CSE and the Securities Act, which is you have a timely disclosure obligation, right? So as soon as the decision is being made, i.e. the agreement signed, the board resolution passed, depending on the nature of the corporate update, the corporate transaction, you now have a disclosable event. And yeah, you're right. You can be sitting on the fence, not knowing what's going to happen at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and not have all this come together and materialize till 1 o'clock in the morning. And then you have disclosable event, which means you have to put it out as soon as possible. My practice, as uncomfortable as it is often IROC is great. They are up early. There is more time than people think before the market opens, which is get it in front of them. If this is a bet the company transaction that's coming through, pick up the phone too. And they do know what they're doing. And if it does warrant it, they will halt while they review and get your news release, right? If it's not and it's minor comments, there is more time than people think to get that resolved before market actually opens. So there is that morning window there. I have run into a few probably, well, you just wait to the next day so you can get it in. No, there's no waiting. There is no waiting in the word material and disclosure.
Got it. Thank you. Next question here. How does an issuer deal with third parties that disseminate the issuer news and perhaps manipulates the disclosure? And they've given an example here, and everyone is familiar with Stockwatch. You might have a very long press release that their editors will take and shorten it. How does an issuer deal with that? Interesting question.
It
is an interesting one.
The interesting part was the implication of the manipulation part. But I think the point is that the Stockwatch is really it's almost like it's a report on the news release, which is why all the exchanges require a full text wire service. So I think the question here is you've put it out on the full text wire service and then Stockwatch picks up this point. There isn't a lot that the issuer can do directly other than express their displeasure. But remind everybody if there are investors asking questions or regulators asking questions, and I have to share that we often get questions from the regulators. Well, they'll forward us the Stockwatch link and say the issuer announced this, and we have to remind them. Our requirement is that the news release go out on full text wire service, and the issuer did do that. That's here. So I think the key thing there is to remind investors of where the issuer puts out their news releases. As much as we like to search for the best value, if you've got a news wire that you're using regularly, stick to that one. Don't put out 7 news releases in a row on one news wire and then use a different news wire for one and then go back to the other one again. If you're going to switch, get the best value, but make sure that you're getting the proper dissemination and you stick with one. And then you can tell investors, this is where to find our news releases. Remind everybody whether they're posted on CDAR, they're posted on the CSE website. But one of the key things to proper communication with the investors is to always remind them where the official information is from the company. so that anything that they're looking for that might be third party or redistributed or re-reported, even if it wasn't intended to be promotional, it's not the official version from the company. So always remind investors where they can get your official information.
And on that note, you can, if you do find that someone has taken an extract out of context or taken some sort of abbreviated version of your news release that's omitted material information, and as a result, your stock has appreciated or depreciated in an untoward fashion, sometimes you'll get a call saying, you're running one way or another, it's just something going on. And if it's not because something else is in the background that's maybe leaked, you are free to put out a clarifying news release. And again, to take up on Mark's suggestion, say, just to clarify, there is no undisclosed material information, but to be clear, here's our official news release and here's where you can find it, and clarify what, if you've got a sense of what has been misconstrued, you can clarify it. It's your record.
Excellent, thank you. Next question, materiality, it can be challenging to determine. Who has the final responsibility?
The issuer. And you're right, it is, because your business, right? And all service providers it's like going to the doctor. I only know what you told me. So definitely as a service provider, I know for sure I don't always get everything. But it is tricky. In ESG, they're battling it big time in terms of what's material, and it's context driven. And what is material, we see all the time for the micro issuer is not the same for the big issuer. So it's context driven. It is a judgment call. It is not generally a bright line test. And unfortunately, the regulators do have the benefit of hindsight, and we don't. And so, erring on the side of it is not well, I'm yet to have someone call me and say I've over disclosed. I'm in trouble. So I definitely think that erring on the side of caution is the path of least resistance in the long run.
Perfect. Very sound advice there. Okay, well, that concludes our question and answer session. We have recorded today's session, and we will be sharing that with those who've joined us today, as well as sharing it more broadly for anyone else who would like to access the information. Mark and Joanna, if there's any follow-up questions you're comfortable having, someone can reach out. Okay, perfect. Same here at IR Labs. If you need to run something by us, vet a vendor, help brainstorm some ideas on how to create some visibility and amplify the work that you're doing in a very compliant way, feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We wish you a lot of success, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thanks, everyone.